In 2001, something happened inside the palace that Queen Elizabeth never forgot. A piece of her most personal jewelry disappeared without her permission. It was the Burmese Ruby Tiara, the tiara Elizabeth had built herself, filled with 96 Burmese rubies that were meant in tradition to protect the wearer from 96 diseases. For Elizabeth, it was never simply decoration. It had become a private symbol of survival, and when it vanished, suspicion inside the household reportedly fell on Camilla. The disappearance was discovered during a routine inventory at Windsor Castle. A staff member reached the velvet tray where the tiara was kept and froze. The tray was empty. The tiara was gone. Angela Kelly was alerted, and the Queen was told immediately. According to the account behind this story, Elizabeth went to the vault herself and stared at the empty space. She could not publicly announce that a royal jewel had gone missing. That would have created a media storm, embarrassed the monarchy, and raised questions about security inside the palace. So the search happened quietly, behind closed doors. Then came the detail that made the situation even more explosive. Camilla had reportedly been inside the area where the personal collection was being examined. A member of staff allegedly saw her enter. When someone approached, she left quickly, saying she had somewhere else to be and would visit the Queen another time. For weeks, the household was left with a question nobody wanted to ask aloud. Had Camilla taken the Queen's tiara? To understand why Elizabeth reacted so strongly, you have to understand what that tiara meant. The Burmese Ruby Tiara was not an inherited antique pulled from a vault. Elizabeth created it in 1973. Cartier used diamonds removed from another tiara, and Elizabeth combined them with 96 rubies presented to her by the people of Burma in 1947. In Burmese tradition, rubies were associated with protection from sickness and evil. The number 96 was significant because Burmese tradition connected it with 96 diseases. Elizabeth wore the tiara as if it were a shield, and few periods of her reign made that symbolism feel more powerful than 1992. That year, the royal family was hit by one crisis after another. Prince Andrew separated from Sarah Ferguson. Princess Anne's marriage ended. Then Andrew Morton's book about Diana brought deeply private royal turmoil into public view. The monarchy was being forced to watch its family problems become international headlines, and then Windsor Castle caught fire. On November 20th, 1992, a fire that began in the Queen's private chapel spread through the castle. Firefighters battled the flames for hours. Parts of the roof collapsed. St. George's Hall was badly damaged. More than 100 rooms were affected, and the cost of the destruction ran into tens of millions of pounds. That evening, Elizabeth walked around the castle and saw the place that had been part of her life since childhood, damaged by fire. 4 days later, she publicly described 1992 as her annus horribilis, her horrible year. Yet the Burmese Ruby Tiara survived. That survival became part of its mythology inside the royal household. Elizabeth had lived through scandals, deaths, constitutional pressure, and now a devastating fire. The tiara remained intact, so when it disappeared years later, the emotional impact was far greater than the loss of an expensive jewel. It was the disappearance of something Elizabeth believed had protected her. Then, according to the account, 3 weeks later, Camilla returned carrying the tiara. She reportedly approached Elizabeth as if nothing had happened, thanked her for letting her have it, and handed it back. Elizabeth's response was controlled. She told Camilla that she had been looking for it, and that Camilla had no right to take it. The tiara was returned, but according to the story, something else was gone for good: Elizabeth's trust. And that is where the jewelry dispute allegedly became a much larger question of inheritance. Because Elizabeth was not simply protecting objects, she was deciding who was worthy of carrying the history attached to them. The next few months made the whole situation even more painful. In February 2002, Princess Margaret suffered a final stroke and died. Margaret had already experienced serious health problems and several strokes, but this final one came suddenly. Margaret was not simply Elizabeth's sister. She was one of the few people alive who had known Elizabeth before she became queen. They had grown up together, lived through the Second World War together, and shared a childhood that no later member of the royal family could truly understand. Then, only 2 months later, the Queen Mother died at 101. Elizabeth had lost two of the people most deeply connected to the woman she had been before the crown. Whatever Elizabeth personally believed about the missing tiara, the timing became part of the story surrounding it. After the funerals, the account says Elizabeth tightened control over several of her most personal jewels. The Burmese Ruby Tiara and other pieces were reportedly moved to a more secure location, accessible only to Elizabeth and Angela Kelly. And if that were the only jewel Elizabeth treated differently, the story might have ended there. It did not. Because the royal collection contains pieces whose histories are far darker and far more complicated than their appearance suggests. Take the coronation necklace. At its center is the Koh-i-Noor, a diamond whose history is inseparable from colonial conquest and the forced removal of power from a child ruler. In 1849, 10-year-old Maharaja Duleep Singh was removed from the throne of the Sikh Empire. He was separated from his mother, Rani Jind Kaur, and the diamond was surrendered into British possession. The stone eventually became part of the British crown jewels. The coronation necklace itself became one of the most recognizable pieces associated with royal ceremony. Elizabeth wore it for decades. It appeared around her neck during formal occasions when the symbolism of monarchy mattered as much as the ceremony itself. But the history of the stone could not be separated from the power that had taken it. That was one reason these jewels carried a weight far beyond their monetary value. The same was true of the Cullinan diamonds. In 1905, the enormous Cullinan rough diamond was discovered in South Africa. It weighed more than 3,000 carats and was eventually cut into 9 major stones, along with numerous smaller pieces. The largest stones became part of the crown jewels, including the famous stones mounted in the sovereign scepter and imperial state crown. Other sections became large brooch stones. Elizabeth wore those diamonds repeatedly. They were beautiful, but they were also connected physically to the crown itself. They came from the same extraordinary stone that supplied some of the monarchy's most important regalia. That distinction mattered. Elizabeth did not treat every jewel as interchangeable. Some pieces could be loaned, some could be inherited, some could be worn by other members of the family, and some, in her private understanding, belonged to a completely different category. One of the clearest examples was Queen Victoria's miniature crown. That crown was born from grief. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria's life changed permanently. She wore black for the remainder of her life. She preserved rituals connected to Albert and refused to let his presence disappear from her daily world. Years into her mourning, Victoria commissioned a miniature crown using diamonds from her own personal jewelry. The result was not a state crown designed to project power. It was a private object tied to one woman's grief. When Victoria died in 1901, the crown was placed on her coffin. It was later returned to the royal collection and eventually placed in the Jewel House at the Tower of London. Elizabeth did not turn it into a fashionable accessory. She left it alone because the crown represented something different. It was not merely a tiara, it was a mourning object. And bringing it back onto a living head could have stripped away the meaning Victoria had given it. Then came the Vladimir Tiara, the jewel that survived a revolution. The tiara belonged to Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, one of the most prominent women in the Romanov court. When revolution erupted in Russia in 1917, her jewels were hidden inside the Vladimir Palace in St. Petersburg. A British art dealer and agent, Albert Stopford, eventually entered the palace, found the hidden jewels and smuggled them out. The circumstances were extraordinary. He had to move through a city in revolution while the Romanov world was collapsing around him. In 1918, Nicholas II, Alexandra, and their 5 children were executed in the basement of the Ipatiev house. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for centuries, ended in blood. The Vladimir tiara survived. Queen Mary later acquired it, had it repaired, and modified it so that different pendant drops could be worn with it. Pearls could be used for one look, emeralds for another. Elizabeth inherited the tiara in 1953. She wore it throughout her reign, and according to the account, Camilla specifically admired it and regarded it as appropriate for a future queen consort. Yet during Elizabeth's lifetime, the Vladimir remained associated with the queen. That is why what happened after Elizabeth's death attracted attention. The tiara appeared publicly on Catherine, Princess of Wales. Royal jewelry does not always need a written announcement to send a message. The person chosen to wear a historic piece can communicate continuity, preference, and institutional direction without anyone saying a word. But there was one final tiara that made the entire story impossible to ignore: the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara. In October 2023, just over a year after Elizabeth's death, Camilla appeared at a formal dinner wearing it. The room did not need an announcement. Everyone knew what they were looking at. For roughly 7 decades, that tiara had been part of Elizabeth's visual identity. Queen Mary gave it to Elizabeth as a wedding gift in 1947. Elizabeth wore it on her wedding day and continued wearing it for decades afterward. It appeared as she met presidents, opened parliament, travelled around the world, endured family scandals, and carried the monarchy through enormous change. It became so closely associated with Elizabeth that seeing it on another queen was almost like watching a photograph of Elizabeth re. And there was another layer to Elizabeth's thinking. She understood symbolism better than almost anyone alive. She knew that a photograph of a royal wearing a particular jewel could travel farther than a speech. She knew that a tiara could quietly signal continuity. She also knew that removing a jewel from public view could say something without a single official statement. That is why the question of who received what after her death became so fascinating. There was never going to be a simple list of diamonds with names beside them. Some pieces were personal, some belonged to the crown, some carried centuries of history. and some had become so associated with Elizabeth that separating the jewel from her image felt almost impossible. For 70 years she was the constant. Everyone else changed around her. Prime ministers changed, presidents changed, royal marriages changed, children grew up, divorced, married again, and became parents themselves. Elizabeth remained. The jewels became witnesses to that entire transformation, and when she died, those witnesses suddenly became available to a new generation. But perhaps the most revealing detail is what happened to the meaning of the collection itself. Elizabeth understood that a royal jewel could become a kind of language. A necklace could signal authority, a brooch could mark mourning, a tiara could connect one woman to another generation. She knew that a photograph of a royal wearing a particular jewel could travel farther than any speech, and that meant choosing the wearer was never a trivial decision. And that is the deeper meaning behind this entire story. Elizabeth could not control what would happen to every jewel after her death. She could protect certain pieces. She could secure others. She could make private wishes known, but she could not freeze the royal collection in time. Camilla outlasted her restrictions. The woman Elizabeth had once kept at a distance was eventually wearing one of the jewels most strongly associated with Elizabeth herself. And that reversal is exactly why the jewelry question became so emotionally charged, because when a royal jewel changes heads, the object itself does not change. The history stays inside it. The people who wore it before remain part of its story. The grief remains, the wars remain, the political decisions remain, the uncomfortable origins remain, and so does the memory of the person who spent decades deciding who should carry that history next. Princess Anne inherited specific personal pieces from her mother, and according to the account, she was deeply involved in discussions surrounding Elizabeth's wishes. She has been portrayed as fiercely protective of her mother's legacy. That creates a new question. Can anyone actually hold the line Elizabeth drew? Because Elizabeth spent decades separating personal jewelry from state regalia, memory from ceremony, and sentimental objects from pieces that could be freely circulated. Some of those boundaries have already disappeared, others remain, and that means the story is not really about whether Camilla can wear royal jewelry. She already can. The real question is which pieces Elizabeth's wishes can still protect, and which pieces will eventually cross the final boundaries she spent her lifetime drawing. Because royal jewels are not just diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and pearls. They are memory, they are power, they are grief, they are conquest, they are survival. And sometimes they are the last physical evidence of what one generation wanted the next generation to remember. Elizabeth spent 70 years deciding who could wear those memories. After her death, that decision passed into other hands, and the most uncomfortable part of the story is this: the jewels may have changed heads, but the history inside them did not. For some pieces, the battle may already be over. For others, it may have only just begun.